On the first morning of every month, just as the courthouse clock struck 8, the retired mail carrier parked his faded pickup beside an abandoned farmhouse, walked slowly to a weathered mailbox leaning slightly toward the gravel road, slipped a handwritten envelope inside, touched the rusted red flag with 2 fingers, and quietly drove away. He had repeated the same ritual for nearly 20 years, even though no one had lived there for longer than that. The envelope never carried a stamp. It never listed a name or address. Yet he never missed a month. Most people assumed grief had simply become habit. I believed that too, until I noticed something impossible. On the following morning, the mailbox was always empty again, even though no one had been seen anywhere near the property. If you've ever believed gratitude deserves to outlive the moment it was earned, stay with me. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I taught American history at the only high school in Ashbrook County, a farming community where everyone believed they already knew every story worth telling. That confidence usually lasted until someone older smiled quietly and said nothing. The abandoned Carter farmhouse stood along the road my students traveled every day on the school bus. Broken porch boards sagged beneath years of rain. Wild vines climbed the chimney. One upstairs window had been shattered so long ago that birds nested inside every spring. Only one thing never seemed neglected. The mailbox. Someone painted the post every few years. The hinges never rusted shut. The little red flag always moved freely. My students joked that the mailbox looked healthier than the house itself. One chilly morning after class, I happened to see Harold Bennett arrive precisely on schedule. Everyone knew Harold. For 40 years, he had delivered mail across nearly every dirt road in the county, before retiring from the United States Army Transportation Corps and later from the Postal Service. People described him with almost identical words. Dependable, patient, quiet. The sort of man who remembered birthdays without ever mentioning his own. I watched from my parked car as he removed a single cream-colored envelope from the inside pocket of his old brown jacket. No stamp, no address, no name. He placed it gently into the mailbox, straightened the small red flag, rested one weathered hand against the wooden post, then simply nodded once before walking back toward his truck. He never looked toward the empty house. He never opened the gate. He never lingered. The entire visit lasted less than 2 minutes. Curiosity finally overcame politeness. The next afternoon, I drove back after school, expecting to find the envelope exactly where Harold had left it. Instead, the mailbox stood completely empty. No torn paper, no scattered letters, nothing. I opened the rusted door twice to make certain. Still nothing. The farmhouse remained locked. The weeds surrounding the porch showed no fresh footprints. There was no second road leading behind the property. No nearby neighbor close enough to play a practical joke. Someone, or something, had removed an envelope that was never addressed to anyone. As I stood beside the lonely mailbox, a passing pickup slowed just long enough for an elderly farmer to roll down his window. "You looking for Harold's letter?" I turned toward him in surprise. "You know about it?" The old farmer smiled faintly. "Everybody knows." He looked toward the abandoned farmhouse before adding one sentence that stayed with me the entire drive home. "The strange part isn't that he leaves one. It's that he's been doing it longer than anyone remembers." For the next several days, the abandoned farmhouse occupied my thoughts far more than the Revolutionary War lesson plans waiting on my desk. Every explanation I invented collapsed beneath one stubborn fact. Harold Bennett faithfully delivered a letter to an empty mailbox every month, yet the letter always disappeared before the next day. If someone collected it, they never left a trace. If no one collected it, where did it go? By the following Friday, I decided to begin where any history teacher would. I started asking people who had been around long enough to remember. My first stop was the Ashbrook Post Office. The building looked almost unchanged from photographs taken decades earlier. Brass mailboxes still lined one wall, and an old portrait of rural mail carriers hung behind the customer counter. Daniel Rhodes, the current postmaster, greeted me with an easy smile. "You must be Miss Mitchell. I've heard you're the person who remembers everything." He laughed softly. "Only the important things." I wanted to ask about Harold. His expression became thoughtful. I wondered how long it would take. You knew someone would eventually ask? When people notice consistency, curiosity usually follows. I hesitated before mentioning the farmhouse. The mailbox. Daniel nodded immediately. "So, that's what caught your attention." He invited me into a small office lined with faded postal maps and route books dating back nearly 50 years. Without saying another word, he opened an old ledger containing retired delivery assignments. Harold's name appeared on Route 340 consecutive years, no interruptions. No replacements, except during Army Reserve training weekends early in his career. "He never requested another route?" I asked. "Never. Even after retiring?" Daniel smiled. He officially retired. But habits don't always read retirement paperwork. He reached into a cabinet and removed a yellowed county route map. One address had been circled in blue ink: the abandoned Carter farmhouse. Harold asked me one favor the day he turned in his postal keys. "What favor?" "Never remove that mailbox." "Why?" I asked. "And?" Daniel shrugged gently. He said someday the reason would matter more than the answer. The sentence sounded strangely familiar, like someone who believed understanding had to be earned rather than handed over. Before leaving, I asked one final question. "Has anyone ever seen him mail those letters?" Daniel looked directly at me. "That's the interesting part. They aren't mailed? They've never entered the postal system." Outside the office, I stood silently for several moments. If Harold wasn't delivering mail, then what exactly was he delivering? That afternoon, I stopped at Mildred's Diner, where retired farmers gathered every day after lunch. Mentioning Harold produced the same respectful smiles I had already begun noticing throughout town. "He never missed a snowstorm," one man said. "He walked Route 3 when the bridge washed out," another added. "He remembered every birthday on my mother's road," someone else recalled. Everyone admired him. No one mocked the monthly letters. Yet whenever I asked about the abandoned farmhouse, conversations quietly changed direction. Finally, an elderly waitress refilled my coffee before leaning closer. "My husband worked beside Harold for 27 years. Did he know?" She nodded slowly. "He knew enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough never to interrupt." Before I could ask another question, she reached beneath the counter and handed me a faded photograph. It showed Harold standing beside another rural mail carrier in front of the Carter farmhouse sometime during the early 1980s. Both men wore Postal Service uniforms. Both smiled broadly. Across the bottom, written in careful blue ink, appeared one simple sentence: "Some routes never really end." As I turned the photograph over, A second discovery waited on the back. The other mail carrier's name had been carefully written beneath the picture: Thomas Carter. The abandoned farmhouse had once belonged to Harold's closest co-worker, and suddenly the mystery was no longer about an empty mailbox. It had become a story about a friendship that someone had never stopped honoring. The faded photograph remained on my desk throughout the weekend. Every time I looked at Harold Bennett and Thomas Carter, standing shoulder to shoulder in their postal uniforms, the same question returned. If the abandoned farmhouse had belonged to Harold's closest friend, why had no one ever mentioned Thomas when they spoke about the mysterious monthly letters? In a town where people remembered every harvest, wedding, and snowstorm, forgetting a man like that seemed almost impossible. Monday afternoon, I drove back to the old farmhouse. This time I parked farther down the gravel road and walked the final few hundred yards. The mailbox stood exactly where it always had. Fresh paint covered the wooden post. The brass latch moved smoothly. Someone had quietly cared for it long after caring for the house itself no longer made sense. As I examined the ground, another detail caught my attention. The weeds around the porch had grown waist-high. The grass surrounding the mailbox had not. Someone trimmed it regularly. The pattern repeated itself month after month with almost military precision. Harold wasn't simply leaving letters. He was maintaining a promise. The following morning, I visited the County Historical Society hoping to find information about Thomas Carter. Mrs. Evelyn Ross, the volunteer archivist, disappeared into the storage room before returning with a thick binder filled with newspaper clippings. Thomas appeared often. Postal safety awards, community fundraisers, holiday food drives, volunteer fire department dinners. He seemed to have spent his life helping everyone else. Then one article stopped me. It carried a small photograph of Harold and Thomas delivering emergency supplies after a severe winter storm nearly 35 years earlier. The headline read, "Two rural mail carriers keep isolated families connected during historic blizzard." Neither man looked interested in recognition. Both simply smiled beside overloaded mail trucks. "What happened to Thomas?" I asked quietly. Mrs. Ross closed the binder with unusual care. "He passed away many years ago." "Illness?" She shook her head. "Heart attack. Suddenly." "And the farmhouse?" "His wife passed a few years later." "No children?" "No." The silence between us seemed to explain why the property had slowly disappeared from memory. No descendants remained to protect it. As I prepared to leave, Mrs. Ross hesitated. "There was always one thing I never understood." "What was that?" "Thomas left no personal letters." "None?" "Not one." The statement lingered in my mind all afternoon. That evening I happened to see Harold leaving the grocery store, carrying only a loaf of bread, coffee, and a package of writing paper. Instead of approaching immediately, I simply walked beside him toward the parking lot. "Mr. Bennett?" He smiled politely. "History teacher. I suppose that's easier to remember than Sarah." "It'll become Sarah when we've known each other longer." His gentle humor made the conversation easier. "I've been learning about Thomas Carter." His expression softened. "He was a good man." "I've heard that from everyone." "They're right," I hesitated. "Would you mind telling me why you still visit his mailbox?" Harold looked toward the distant hills before answering. "Not yet." "I understand." "No." He smiled kindly. "I don't think you do." There was no harshness in his voice, only patience. "You've been searching for a reason." "I have. The reason isn't inside the mailbox." He opened the driver's door of his pickup. "It's inside the promise." Before I could ask another question, he reached into the truck and removed a small, weathered wooden key. It looked too old to belong to any modern lock. He turned it thoughtfully between his fingers before slipping it back into his pocket. "I've carried this longer than my postal keys." "What does it open?" Harold looked directly at me. "The place where every letter has always been waiting." For the first time, I realized the empty mailbox had never been the destination. It had only been the beginning. For the next 2 days, I could think about little except the old wooden key Harold Bennett had quietly slipped back into his pocket. His words echoed through every history lesson I taught. The mailbox is only the beginning. Whatever waited beyond that key mattered far more than the abandoned farmhouse itself. I stopped searching old newspaper archives. I stopped questioning retired postal workers. Instead, I decided to trust Harold enough to let him decide when the story should finally be told. Thursday afternoon, I found him repainting the weathered mailbox. The small red flag rested on an old newspaper, while he carefully brushed fresh white paint onto the wooden post. "You don't have to do that anymore," I said. He smiled without looking up. "That's usually when something stops lasting." "You've been maintaining this alone?" "For a long time. The house is falling apart. It belongs to time." He gently touched the mailbox door. "This belongs to a promise." The distinction seemed important. We worked together quietly for nearly an hour. I cleaned old leaves from the roadside ditch, while Harold replaced several loose screws on the mailbox hinge. Neither of us spoke much. The silence felt comfortable, as though conversation would arrive only after the work deserved it. When we finished, Harold looked toward the abandoned farmhouse. "I think you've earned something." He reached into his jacket pocket and placed the weathered wooden key in my hand. It felt surprisingly heavy. "What does it open?" "You'll see." Without another word, he led me toward the rear of the farmhouse. Tall weeds nearly concealed a small wooden shed standing beneath 2 ancient maple trees. Unlike the house, the shed remained remarkably well maintained. The roof had been repaired. Fresh oil coated the hinges. A small brass lock secured the door. Harold inserted the key. The lock opened with almost no resistance. Inside stood shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. Not tools, not farming equipment. Boxes. Dozens of carefully labeled cedar boxes. Each carried a handwritten year. 2006, 2007, 2008. Every year until the present. Harold lifted down the oldest box and placed it gently on a workbench. "You wanted to know where the letters went." He slowly removed the lid. Inside rested 12 cream-colored envelopes tied neatly together with blue ribbon. Every envelope had already been opened. Everyone remained completely blank on the outside. "You keep them." "I always have." "I thought someone collected them." "I do. Every New Year's Day." I looked at him in confusion. "Then why leave them in the mailbox at all?" Harold picked up the first envelope with extraordinary care. "Because gratitude deserves to arrive somewhere before it belongs to memory." He unfolded a single handwritten page. The ink had faded, but remained perfectly readable. Dear Thomas, today I finally laughed again. Mary smiled for the first time since the accident. I wish I had thanked you properly while you were here. The letter ended with only one sentence. I'll write again next month. Harold quietly folded the page. There are 12 every year. For nearly 20 years? He nodded. I've never missed one. My eyes drifted across the dozens of cedar boxes surrounding us. Hundreds of letters, thousands of handwritten pages. Not hidden, protected. You've spent 20 years writing to someone who can't answer. Harold smiled gently. No. I've spent 20 years making sure I never forget to say thank you. He walked toward one faded photograph hanging on the wall. Thomas Carter stood beside him, holding two young children. One child looked remarkably familiar. That's you, I whispered. Harold nodded. No. He pointed toward the little boy standing beside Thomas. That's my son. Only then did I notice Mary, Harold's wife, standing beside them. All four smiled together in front of the farmhouse. What happened? Harold looked at the photograph for several quiet moments. Everything you think this story is about, he paused, changes now. Before I could ask another question, his cell phone rang. The county planning office. After a brief conversation, Harold slowly lowered the phone. They moved the demolition schedule. My heart sank. When? He looked once more toward the old mailbox outside the shed. Monday morning. Only 4 days remained before the place where 20 years of gratitude had begun would disappear forever. I returned to the abandoned farmhouse before sunrise on Friday. The county planning office had confirmed that demolition would begin first thing Monday morning. Less than 4 days remained before the old house, the weathered mailbox, and the little cedar shed behind it would disappear beneath heavy machinery. Yet when I arrived, Harold Bennett was not standing beside the mailbox. He was sitting quietly inside the shed. One cedar box rested open across his lap. He did not appear sad. He looked grateful. You came early, he said. I couldn't stop thinking about the letters. He smiled gently. Neither can I. For several moments, we simply listened to the wind moving through the maple trees outside. Then Harold carefully untied another blue ribbon. This one was written after my son graduated from college. He unfolded the page with the same care someone might reserve for a priceless photograph. Dear Thomas, today, David became the first person in our family to earn a university degree. Mary cried harder than he did. You once told me that hope grows faster when someone believes in us before we believe in ourselves. You believed that about me. I hope I finally earned it. Harold folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. He never read a single one, I whispered. No. But every month they reminded me to live like someone who deserved his kindness. The sentence changed everything I thought I understood. These letters were never written for Thomas. They were written to prevent Harold from forgetting the man he wanted to become. I looked around the shed again. There must be hundreds. 228. You counted? I wrote everyone. He smiled. Mail carriers count almost everything. For the first time since meeting him, I asked the question that mattered most. What did Thomas actually do for you? Harold remained silent for a long while. Finally, he reached toward another faded photograph resting inside the oldest cedar box. Unlike the others, this picture showed no smiling faces. A much younger Harold stood beside a broken pickup truck covered with snow. Mary held a small boy wrapped tightly in blankets. Thomas knelt beside the truck, fastening heavy chains around the tires. "The winter of 1984, Harold said quietly. "I had just returned from Army service. Work was scarce. Our savings were gone." He paused. "I had already decided to leave town." I looked at him in surprise. "You were moving away? I thought my family deserved better than another season of uncertainty." He turned the photograph over. Written across the back were 7 simple words. "One more week changed everything. Thomas found out before we left. What did he do? He asked me to wait 7 days." "Only 7?" Harold nodded. I trusted him. Within that week, Thomas had quietly spoken with the county postmaster, convinced him to interview Harold for an open rural mail route, and personally helped repair the truck Harold needed to reach every farm along Route 3. He never told me he arranged the interview. "How did you find out?" I didn't. Not until his wife mentioned it years later. Harold looked toward the old mailbox outside the shed. "Without that 1 week, my family leaves. My son never grows up here. I never become a mail carrier." Everything that followed in Harold's life had rested upon one quiet act that Thomas never claimed credit for. Just then, a pickup truck pulled into the driveway. 2 county surveyors stepped out carrying rolled construction plans. One of them approached respectfully. "Mr. Bennett?" Harold stood. "We wanted you to hear this from us." The surveyor removed his cap. "The demolition is still scheduled." My heart sank. "But," he pointed toward the roadside, "the county only purchased the farmhouse." Harold looked confused. "The mailbox sits inside the public postal easement." The surveyor smiled gently. "It isn't ours to remove." For the first time in nearly 20 years, I watched Harold's eyes fill with tears. The house might disappear, but the place where gratitude faithfully arrived every month would remain standing. Monday morning arrived beneath a pale winter sky. Long before the demolition crews reached the old Carter farmhouse, Harold Bennett was already standing beside the weathered mailbox, holding the newest cream-colored envelope between both hands. For the first time in nearly 20 years, he did not place it inside immediately. Instead, he simply looked at the old wooden post that had quietly witnessed hundreds of monthly promises. "It survived," I said softly. He smiled. So did the reason for it. The county surveyors had been correct. The farmhouse and the surrounding land belonged to the redevelopment project. The narrow strip of roadside where the mailbox stood remained protected under a long-established postal easement. Legally, the mailbox could stay. Emotionally, however, everything around it was about to disappear. By 8 o'clock, heavy equipment rolled slowly through the open farm gate. Construction workers stepped from their trucks. None behaved carelessly. Most removed their hats after noticing Harold standing beside the mailbox. The site supervisor approached first. "Mr. Bennett." Harold nodded politely. "We'll stay clear of the mailbox. Thank you. And we'll give you as much time as you need." Harold looked at the envelope one final time before opening it instead of placing it inside. "I think this one should finally be read aloud." He unfolded the letter carefully. His voice remained steady. "Dear Thomas, Today, they will take down the house where your friendship changed my family's future. For many years, I believed this mailbox helped me remember you. I know now it was never the mailbox. It was the choice you made when you saw a struggling young father and quietly decided not to walk past him. You never asked for repayment. You probably never imagined these letters. But every month they reminded me to become the kind of man worthy of your example. Thank you for one ordinary week that became an extraordinary lifetime. He folded the letter slowly. No one spoke. Not the workers, not the surveyors, not even the wind seemed willing to interrupt the silence. Then Harold surprised everyone. Instead of placing the envelope into the mailbox, he handed it to me. I think it's time. For what? You keep this month's letter. I looked at him in confusion. But you've never missed putting one in the mailbox. I haven't. He smiled gently. Today, the promise needs another witness. The distinction settled quietly over all of us. A promise hidden forever could easily disappear. A promise shared wisely could continue. As the first section of the old farmhouse came down, Harold never turned to watch. Instead, he walked toward the small cedar shed. Together, we carried every carefully labeled letterbox into the County Historical Society's climate-controlled archive, where Mrs. Evelyn Ross had already prepared shelving for them. She looked at the rows of cedar boxes with visible amazement. How many lives are inside these? Harold smiled. Only one. She looked puzzled. My own. That afternoon, the town council held an emergency meeting. Several residents wanted to preserve pieces of the farmhouse. Others suggested moving the mailbox into a museum. Harold quietly stood before the council. I appreciate every kind thought. He paused. But please don't build a monument to me. One council member asked, Then what should we preserve? Harold answered without hesitation. The habit. Silence filled the room. The first day of every month. He looked around at neighbors who had known him for decades. Write one letter thanking someone who changed your life. You don't have to mail it. You don't even have to show anyone. But never allow gratitude to become something you only feel. Practice it. The room remained quiet for several long moments. Then the school principal slowly stood. Our students could do that. The pastor nodded. So could our church. The librarian smiled. We'll keep paper beside the front desk. One idea quietly became many. As the meeting ended, I glanced through the courthouse window toward the distant road. The farmhouse was gone. The old mailbox still stood alone beneath the winter sky. For the first time since discovering Harold's mysterious ritual, I understood that the mailbox had never been preserving the past. It had been patiently waiting for an entire community to inherit the future. The first gratitude letter day arrived on the first morning of January, beneath a sky as clear as polished glass. No banners hung across Main Street. No television cameras appeared. The town council had intentionally avoided turning Harold Bennett's quiet idea into a public celebration. Instead, stacks of cream-colored stationery quietly appeared in places where people naturally gathered. The public library, the church foyer, the post office lobby, the high school office. Beside every stack rested a simple handwritten sign. Write one letter, thank one person. You never have to mail it. By 8 o'clock that morning, the old roadside mailbox stood exactly where it always had. The farmhouse behind it was gone. Only a wide field covered with fresh winter grass remained. Yet the mailbox no longer looked lonely. People approached one at a time. A young mechanic, an elderly widow, a firefighter still wearing his station jacket, 2 teenage sisters. None stayed long. Each quietly slipped an envelope inside before walking away without waiting to see who came next. No speeches, no applause, only gratitude. Harold stood several yards away beneath the maple trees. He never touched the mailbox. "It's theirs now," he whispered. I smiled. "I think it always was." Later that afternoon, students from my American history classes joined me at the roadside. Most had never met Thomas Carter. Several had been born years after his passing. Yet every one of them carried a handwritten envelope. One student admitted quietly, "I wrote to my grandfather." Another smiled shyly. "I thanked my 4th grade teacher." A young football player looked down at his boots. "I wrote to my mom." Watching them, I finally understood why Harold had insisted the letters remain private. Gratitude becomes strongest when it asks for nothing in return. That evening, the town gathered inside the community hall for what everyone assumed would be Harold's final public appearance. He stood behind the small wooden podium, wearing the same brown jacket he had worn while delivering rural mail for decades. He carried no prepared speech, only one cream-colored envelope. "I've spent many years writing to my friend Thomas," he began quietly. "I thought those letters belonged between the two of us." He looked around the room. I was wrong. The audience remained perfectly still. They were never written because Thomas needed to hear them. They were written because I needed to remember. He slowly opened the final envelope. "This is the only letter I will ever read aloud." His voice remained steady. "Dear Thomas, this morning I watched children thank people they love. I watched strangers remember kindness that changed their lives. For 20 years, I believed I was keeping one promise. Today, I finally understand. The promise was never to write letters. It was to never allow gratitude to become silent." Harold carefully folded the page. Then, instead of returning it to his pocket, he handed it to me. History belongs to people willing to carry it forward. I accepted the envelope with both hands. No one applauded. Some moments deserve quiet more than noise. As everyone prepared to leave, the postmaster walked to the front, carrying a polished brass plaque no larger than a notebook. It would not be attached to the mailbox. It would stand on a simple wooden post beside it. The inscription contained only one sentence. "Some routes never really end, nothing else, no names, no dates, no explanation. Anyone wishing to understand would have to ask." Exactly as every meaningful story begins. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently beneath the streetlights. The old mailbox stood alone beside the road, waiting for another month, another letter, another quiet reminder that the greatest debts are not repaid once. They are honored for a lifetime. And somewhere beyond the silence of winter, one faithful friendship continued delivering hope long after the final mail route had ended. 1 year later, the old Carter farmhouse existed only in photographs. Wildflowers now covered the field, where its front porch had once faced the county road. The cedar shed had been carefully relocated to the Historical Society, preserving every box of handwritten letters in a climate-controlled room where time could no longer erase them. Yet every visitor who came searching for the story always ended up in the same place: the roadside mailbox. It still stood beneath the two old maple trees. Fresh white paint protected the wooden post. The little red flag moved as smoothly as it had decades before. Most people who stopped there never knew the names Harold Bennett or Thomas Carter. They did not need to. The mailbox had become something larger than two friends. It had become a quiet invitation. On the first morning of every month, the people of Ashbrook continued arriving one at a time. Farmers before sunrise, teachers after school, nurses finishing overnight shifts, high school students carrying carefully folded envelopes. Some letters thanked parents. Others honored teachers, coaches, neighbors, pastors, military brothers, or lifelong friends. A few were written to people who had already passed away. None required a stamp. None required an address. Everyone required gratitude. Harold rarely placed letters into the mailbox anymore. His arthritis had slowly made long walks more difficult, and after another difficult winter, he accepted that younger legs would carry the tradition farther than his own. Instead, he spent the first Saturday of each month at the Historical Society, carefully placing the newest collection of letters into a cedar box labeled with the current year. He still counted every envelope. Old habits never completely disappear. One afternoon, I found him there alone. The newest cedar box rested open on the work table. Inside lay more than 100 handwritten envelopes. Nearly half had been written by students from my history classes. Harold smiled as I looked through them. I used to think these boxes recorded my gratitude. He gently rested one hand on the polished cedar lid. They don't. What do they record? He looked toward the window where children laughed outside beneath the maple trees. They record hope. The answer felt exactly right. Each letter represented one person choosing not to let kindness fade into memory. Not because anyone required repayment. Because gratitude practiced regularly changes the person expressing it. Before leaving that afternoon, Harold handed me one final envelope. It contained no letter, only a single photograph. Thomas Carter and Harold Bennett stood beside an old rural mail truck, smiling after another long delivery route many decades earlier. On the back, written in Thomas's familiar handwriting, were just 8 words. Pass kindness forward before someone asks for it. I understood then that Harold had never been repaying a debt. He had been multiplying a gift. As I walked back toward the roadside mailbox that evening, a little boy carefully reached up on his toes to place his own envelope inside. His grandfather waited quietly beside him. "What did you write?" the older man asked. The child smiled. "I thanked my teacher." "Did she ask for a letter?" "No." "Then why write it?" The little boy looked toward the mailbox before answering with the simple certainty only children possess. "Because good things shouldn't have to wait." The old man nodded. "So they shouldn't." If this story reminded you that the smallest expressions of gratitude can echo across generations, I hope you'll find someone to thank while you still have the chance. A few sincere words, spoken or written without expecting anything in return, may become the beginning of a legacy you never imagined. May your kindness travel farther than your footsteps, your gratitude outlive your circumstances, and your quiet promises continue reaching hearts long after every road has changed.